about property demolition and reasons why your property could face this act. So I'm pretty sure that a lot of us are not new to property demolition. That is the act of properties being destroyed, demolished. So, and then we are very concerned with the fact that lately a lot of buildings and shops, basically buildings, have been demolished by the government, and this has raised a lot of questions as to whether this is right, whether the government have legal rights to actually do this, whether it is illegal for your property, for your own building to be demolished. I mean, you did build it, you are the owner of the building, so why should it be demolished? So it has made a lot of people ask that, is it right? Do they have a legal right to do this? Can they and what could amount to this? Like what could cause for a building to be demolished? So today we're going to be talking about that, and briefly talking about that. So now let's go into it. So first thing is the question, who can demolish a building? So the government can demolish a building through several government agencies, and private individuals cannot demolish a building unless they take the relevant permits from the relevant regulatories. So now let's go to the next question, which is, does the government have a legal right to demolish a building? So first of all, let's establish the fact that the law that governs land and property in Nigeria, which is the Land Use Act, and that act gives and puts the government in charge of all lands in Nigeria. So what it means is that the government is in charge of the land, all lands in Nigeria, and this is put in their hands as trust. They hold it as trust for we the citizens. So this is why they have the right to also grant you a statutory right of occupancy, and as well as they have that right to grant you that occupancy, that's right, they also have the power to revoke that right. And where the government revokes a right of occupancy, at that point any building or any construction, any development on that building is subject to demolition. So that answers the question as to whether the government have the legal right to demolish buildings. Yes, the government has the right to demolish buildings, and Section 44 of the Constitution also allows government to acquire properties belonging to citizens for general public use. So the Constitution also gives the government the right to also acquire your property, but this is for public use, or where such property is violating the regulations of that state. The government also has the right to revoke your right on that property. So that property then is subject to demolition. So yes, the government has a right to demolish your building and any development on the building. So the next question is whether government demolition can be illegal. Just like how the government has a right to do that, it could also be illegal in the sense that once the necessary due process is not followed, it makes that act of demolition illegal. So you might ask, what is the necessary due process? What is the process that should be followed that will make it legal for the government to demolish your building? And the first and paramount one is that notice should be given to the owner or occupier of the property. The person should be given a notice, and notice should be pasted in a conspicuous area in the building or around the compound or wherever the property is located, so that this notice is not hidden or is not somewhere where it's not obvious for the person, the occupier or the owner of the property. So this notice has to be very, very obvious for persons in that building to take note of. And then this notice should also give the reason as to why the property is being demolished, if it is for public interest, or if it is because it is against it is an illegal building, if it is against the regulations of the states or area, or if it is maybe hazardous, maybe the property could be a threat to the lives of the persons occupying the building. So that this notice should have that. The notice should also have a reasonable time. For a time frame should be stated in the notice, like it should have and the time frame should be a reasonable time, in the sense that it should be a time where it is believed that persons in the building can evacuate, can make necessary appeal if there's a need for appeal towards the order or the notice for demolition, or can make, or just make necessary steps to act on the notice. So that's another process. That notice should also have reasonable time. And then the persons or the owners of or occupier of the property too should be compensated, should be well compensated. And this means this compensation is not generally for every building that is about to be demolished. It is for, let's say, we'll still go into it, but like briefly saying, it's just for persons who maybe the government is revoking their rights due to the need to use the property, or due to say the the land is needed for government, for public use. For instance, those persons are liable to get compensated. It is required for the government to actually compensate them. But for examples of persons that probably build or construct illegal buildings, then those kind of persons do not have a right to compensation. So basically, the due process is first that a notice should be given. That notice should be put in a conspicuous and obvious place for persons, the owner or the occupiers of the property, to take note of it. That notice should give the reason for the demolition. That notice should also give a reasonable time for the persons to act on the notice, as well as compensation to be given to the persons. So basically, and then this compensation should be awarded depending on some factors, due to, for example, the value of the property, or for the reason for the demolition, or if it is a rental, for the amount paid for the rent for that year. So these compensations too are not just given. They're not just compensations that are just decided on. These compensations are actually awarded depending on certain factors, and each person. And once the government is demolishing, like I said, demolishing your property for public use, then you are liable for compensation. So now let's move to reasons for demolition. Why would your building be subject to demolition? Why does the government have a legal right to actually demolish your building? And the first one is for overriding public interest. Like I earlier stated, that the government has a right to revoke your statutory right of occupancy where there's an overriding interest, or on the public interest on the land. And this could be where the government requires for that land to be used for public purposes, for example, for a road, or establishment or building of a hospital, or anything that is for public use. So once that is a reason why the government can actually revoke your right of occupancy, and the building on that land is subject to demolishment. So the land, that's the reason why your property could be demolished. Then another reason why is if the government is if there's a breach on the provisions of the certificate of occupancy, where this is a certificate of occupancy is a title document given to the owner of a property or owner of a land by the government to this rights to it's your right of statutory right of occupancy. So once you have statutory right of occupancy, the government gives you a certificate of occupancy. So in that certificate of occupancy, there are some terms and that you are expected to follow. So once there is a breach of certain terms in that certificate of occupancy, the government actually has a right to revoke your right of occupancy and then demolish the building. Another one is if the building is on a government acquired land. So government acquired lands are lands that have been, as the name entails, as the name says, the lands that have been acquired by government for specific purposes, and it could be for like I said, like for roads, for schools or hospitals. So where persons unknowingly buy government acquired lands, that means they did not buy. That means that they acquired that land from persons who claim that those lands belong to them, but in actual sense, the land belongs to the government because the government already acquired that land. That means they bought the land from the wrong owners. They did not buy it from the government because government is the one that acquired the land. So once a person builds on that type of land, any building found on that land is subject to demolition. So, and the person would not be compensated, unfortunately. So properties or persons who buy government acquired lands unknowingly, their lands, properties on that land subject to demolition. Then another reason why your property could be demolished is if it is illegal, in the sense that, or if it is low standard. So for example, the building is probably prone to collapsing or flooding or a danger to the health of the persons that are presently occupying that property. That building is subject to demolition. It could be demolished. Another reason why a property could be demolished is if there was no proper permit, like building permit or planning permit was not acquired from the relevant agencies. Once you go ahead to build on a particular, or to construct buildings or developments without the appropriate permits or building plans from the agencies, those properties, those buildings are subject to demolition. They could be demolished and you will not be entitled to any compensation. Another thing is if they do not conform with the planning regulations and standards in that environment. So there are some certain environments where there are some certain types of buildings that should not be erected, or maybe there's a need for you to, if you want to build a skyscraper, maybe it's not it doesn't conform with the planning regulations in that area. So where such buildings are erected, those buildings could also be demolished, as well as buildings that are on roads or places that should not normally be, like maybe buildings that should be, that there are buildings that are on places that should be maybe for drainage, or maybe the buildings that should not, there are some regulations that say that there should be a particular space between a building and maybe a pipeline or electric pole and those sort of things. So where those buildings are found violating those regulations, those buildings are subject to demolition. So how can you avoid this? The first and most important thing for you to do is, before constructing any building or before even purchasing a land or property, ensure you run your due diligence. Due diligence in fact that you should make inquiries, either online or maybe to people in that environment, or going through relevant regulations and knowing the type of buildings that are permitted in that area, knowing if the land you're about to acquire, if it is from, if you are really acquiring from the right owners, or if it's a government acquired land, or if the, and then making sure that you follow the regulations, like applying for the necessary permits, the building plans, and all those things. So just to ensure that you don't have your buildings are not subject to demolition, or years after you have to evacuate because the building is illegal or it's about to collapse. So this thing, it means that right from the start, from the beginning, you should ensure that your building is in compliance with the regulations, that you acquire the property from the original owners, and that all necessary permits are taken to avoid demolition. So there are also instances where you could say that it is illegal for the government to demolish your building, which I stated earlier is where did not follow the due process. And where this occurs, the remedy to that is to actually commence an action against the government. And if, let's say, your compensation is not given, you can actually also sue for wrongful demolition, and you'll be entitled to damages. So that's basically all we are going to talk about today, about demolition, whether the government has a legal right to demolish, the necessary due processes, and what could make the government actually demolish your building, and ways to actually avoid this. So I hope we all have been able to learn one thing or two and understand that the government has a right to actually demolish your buildings, but they have to follow a due process. I hope we all enjoyed today's session. See you next time, next week. Bye everyone.